Hello and welcome to this lecture on Stoicism, and in this lecture we're going to be looking at Stoic physics and the passions. We're going to look a little bit closer at the Stoic view of the emotions and how they work. As we'll see, there's a very sort of nuanced view of the emotions in Stoicism. It's not all negative. There's a sort of distinctions between positive emotions, pre-emotions, and the kind of passions that are detrimental and destructive to our well-being. So, from the Greek word pathe, or passions or emotions, things that affect us, things that sort of have an affect on us. So, not sensations like, we're not talking about sensations like pleasure and pain, the way we sort of respond to things with a positive, or a negative valence. And not pre-emotions, what the Stoics call propatheia. So pre-emotions are things that emerge, things that happen sort of before the emotion itself fully develops. So it's like a first kind of, it's like when we first come upon a place, and if we sort of sense it's not quite right, and we get that sort of feeling of fear, the sort of dread in our stomach. That's kind of the pre-emotion, right? The sort of thing that wells up first before we've formed the belief. So remember, for the Stoics, emotion is all about belief, the sort of belief that we form on the basis of how this thing affects us. So the Stoics, the pre-emotions are prior to the formation of that belief. And we'll always sort of feel the pre-emotions even when we've sort of done away with the belief. We can still sort of feel the pre-emotion of something, even if we're not going to sort of develop the sort of the negative belief on the basis, or the sort of problematic belief on the basis of that thing. So the sort of pre-emotions then are these sort of these initial sort of responses that don't yet form a belief. And the passions are not good feelings, what the Stoics called eupatheia, things like joy, caution, and wishing for things that aren't detrimental, things that are sort of positive. So it's natural for us to feel joy and good feelings when positive things happen. It's natural for us to sort of have this sense of caution towards the future, to sort of have these sort of positive feelings towards things that we want to happen. So those aren't what they mean by the passions. They mean these sort of very strong emotions. And so the passions are essentially, for the Stoics, these strong emotions are false judgments. And so we can distinguish them into four sort of main ones. Delight and distress are about the present, obviously one positive and one negative valence. Lust and fear are about the future. So again, a sort of positive and a sort of negative valence to those emotions. So they're false. They stem from the false beliefs that we develop, or the false judgments we develop on the basis of what we see, what we hear, and what we experience. So in the case of delight, which is a disorder arising from the presence of an apparent good, an exuberant or excessive transport at having secured some coveted object. So that's the idea of delight. So the sort of excessive response to having secured some present good, some coveted object. Excessive because obviously that's not the thing that sort of contributes to our happiness for the Stoics. It's acting well and sort of acting according to virtue. And for distress is simply the disorder originating in distress at present evil. So an exaggerated response to something that we regard as a present evil. And remember, for the Stoics, the only thing that's evil is vice, or acting wrongly, not acting ethically. So if we're sort of distressed about other things that happen, about something that happens in the world, about something that happens to us in terms of wealth or power or stuff like that, for the Stoics, those aren't things that merit getting distressed about. So in the case of lust, a sort of a prospective good, so thinking about the future here, belief of the prospective good, and the subject of this thinks it advantageous to possess it at once upon the spot. So again, the possession of something that we desire drives this kind of strong emotion, and the fear, which is its opposite, is an expectation not of a good thing, but an expectation of evil. And the kind of the belief that something evil is about to happen, and the kind of responses and the emotions that develop on the basis of that disorder. So the idea for the Stoics is to replace these passions by good, healthy states. So instead of the sort of excessive delight, a sort of joy in the presence of something good, a kind of wish, a sort of lesser form of a less problematic form of lust, and then caution instead of fear about the future. So the idea of simply we feel emotions, but they're less intense, and they're not based on false beliefs about how bad or how sort of important something is for us. As we know, a lot of the things that we care about for the Stoics are indifferent, so it doesn't make sense to have these strong emotions about them in regard to our happiness. So let's shift now and talk about Stoic physics, and we'll see this is related to how they sort of make sense of the emotions. Marcus Aurelius says, constantly regard the universe as one living being having one substance and one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception. The perception of this one living being, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are the cooperating causes of all things which exist. Observe too the continuous spinning of the thread and the contexture of the web. So that's the idea, that's the sort of pantheistic idea of the universe. Here, the universe is one living being with a substance and a soul, and how it's kind of unfolding, and it's a rational substance, so it's sort of unfolding itself rationally, and it's unfolding according to the sort of chain of causation that's laid out, the cooperating causes of all things. So it's like a kind of cooperating system, it's one substance. So this gives us an idea of how the Stoics sort of have this pantheistic idea of the universe, and we'll see how that sort of feeds in to their view of the emotions. Okay, so the Stoics' pantheistic view of the universe is extended, it sort of starts from this idea of the four elements. And as we'll see, that this sort of leads on to the material nature of the soul according to Stoicism. So the four elements are fire, air, earth, and water. And we can group them into air and earth and water, which are the passive elements, and fire and air, which are the active elements. And so these two form up Pneuma, which is the kind of active element in existence, in matter, in the universe. And matter is the passive element, which is kind of acted upon and formed by different kinds of pneuma. Right, so this sort of the combination of pneuma and matter leads to this idea of the great chain of Stoic being. Everything in the universe is a combination of pneuma and matter. As we saw, pneuma is the active principle. It's also what makes up souls. And matter is the passive principle. So the fundamental passive and active principles in the universe. So the human soul is a specific form of the general world soul. What I mean by that is that just as the universe as a whole is made up of pneuma and matter in different combinations, the soul is made up of that very same substance. So it's made up of combinations of refined pneuma and matter. So this tells us a lot about the harmony that Stoics saw throughout the universe. Everything is made of the same stuff. Everything from basic material to the most sort of complex creatures like humans, everything is made of the same stuff. Everything contains sort of divine elements, the sort of elements of Pneuma, and everything contains the sort of passive, sort of receptive material that sort of that is the sort of seat for those elements, those active elements. So what Pneuma does is it adds what the Stoics call tonos, which is cohesion or a kind of tension through the body it's part of. So it's Pneuma, the active principle, that gives different kinds of tension to matter. So different types of physical organism are characterized by different levels of tonos. So understanding different sort of organisms and different levels of organism in the universe is about understanding how they're characterized by these different levels of tension, different levels of cohesion, which is created by the kind of Pneuma, the sort of refinement of the Pneuma that they possess, and how it organizes the passive element of matter. So here we can see the four basic forms of substance based on the sort of different combinations of Pneuma and matter. At the most basic level, we have sort of the basic matter, things like a stone, or sort of basic sort of things, and the coherence or tension is called hexis. So it's a particular kind of sort of tension that's created to create material things with a solidity, like stones and other hard objects, or the natural objects that sort of possess this kind of coherence within themselves. The next level is physis, which is the level of sort of living things, particularly plants and those kind of organisms, the coherence of things that grow. And the next level is psyche, which is actually the ancient word for soul, the coherence or tensional movement of animals. So animals possess psyche or soul, in contrast to plants, which possess this idea of physis, a kind of coherence based on natural growth. And finally, the most complicated is logos, which characterizes the rational human soul. So humans have this sort of distinct sort of combination of Pneuma and matter, which is called logos, which is sort of more refined than the sort of coherence or tension in other forms of Pneuma. So it is kind of like a hierarchy here, but all of the elements, all of them are just different expressions of tension, different combinations of Pneuma and matter. So we can see the basic sort of harmony of the universe here for the Greeks. The basic harmony of the universe for the Stoics here is that everything is characterized by these different types of coherence of tonos, these different types of tonos, of Pneuma and matter. So everything is ordered into four different types of tension. And that's where we see this kind of unity of the whole universe. So the central element in the soul is, by the Stoics, according to the Stoics, is the hegemonicon, which basically just means the ruling part. And here we see, for the Stoics, that part is located in the chest, in where we would sort of locate the heart. So there's no sort of distinction between sort of thinking, feeling here. They're all part of this sort of central organ. So the brain isn't a sort of central part of the soul for the Stoics. But we do see here the five senses, and then we have reproduction as well added to that, and voice as well. So we've got a number of elements which sort of lead out from the hegemonicon. So the hegemonicon kind of sends messages via Pneuma to the different senses, and they sort of communicate with the hegemonicon. And so it's our central sort of part. It's the central idea of the soul. And for the Stoics, it's essentially a rational soul. All right, so if we look at the powers within the hegemonicon, in other words, what it does, what it can do, we'll notice the sort of the three disciplines again here, as they're the three kind of capacities of the soul together with reason. So we've got the power of presentation, fantasia, which is the ability to receive images, the ability to receive images or words or whatever the representation is from outside. That's our capacity of fantasia. And we talked about the sort of the discipline of language, the discipline of assent, of only assenting to the fantasia, the presentation, not adding beliefs and judgments to it. That's really important to the Stoics. And then, of course, the impulse, the impulse which leads to action, the kind of which should be an ethical impulse that leads us to act well. And then we've got assent, or judgment, our ability to kind of assent to the things that we see. And reason, of course, logos, is the central characteristic of the soul, that it's a rational soul and it acts on the basis of reason. So other thinkers like Plato, other ancient thinkers, develop a kind of hierarchy of the soul, where reason is kind of reason is on top and other elements are kind of subordinate. That's not the case for the Stoics. Reason is on the same level as other parts of the soul. So this idea in the Stoics of living in harmony with our fate, or living according to nature, we've seen this idea of nature as a kind of rational system. It's sort of physis for the Greeks, which is not just nature in the sense of stuff, it's nature in the sense of this growing, developing, sort of rationally sort of changing system that runs according to its own kind of causal principles. So on the basis of this idea, the Stoics sort of think about our relation to nature as sort of learning to live in harmony with our fate. And that's expressed by this idea of Zeno, this sort of image that Zeno uses about the wise man. And he says the wise man is like a dog tethered to a cart, running alongside and smoothly keeping pace with it, whereas a foolish man is like a god that struggles against the leash, but finds himself dragged alongside the cart anyway. So the wise man is sort of running alongside the cart, and sort of living according to what nature is what nature is doing and what it's sort of demanding of us. The foolish dog sort of struggles against the leash, right? Sort of finds itself pulled anyway. It tries to resist the sort of natural order of things and makes trouble for itself. But if we keep pace and we recognize and we just run along and sort of try and be harmonious with the natural order of things that are going to happen anyway, things that don't depend on us, then it's like we're living in harmony with our fate. So that's the idea that Zeno develops. He says all things are parts of one single system which is called nature. The individual life is good when it is in harmony with nature. So if we think of nature as the Stoics do, in this sort of starting from this pantheistic idea of this sort of rational growing system, then I think we can understand this idea of living in harmony with our fate. It's not just sort of accepting things for their own sake, but accepting that nature is a sort of rational system that sort of embodies the same rationality that's within us. Right, so Marcus Aurelius, no one can lose either the past or the future. How could anyone be deprived of what he does not possess? It is only the present moment of which either stands to be deprived. And if this is all he has, he cannot lose what he does not have. So this emphasizes the importance of the present moment in Stoicism. And I think there are two benefits that we can identify here. The firstly is that hardships become more bearable when we focus on the present, as they're reduced to a succession of fleeting moments. So this is the idea of taking things one moment at a time, not catastrophizing about the future, but just focusing on the problem we have in the present moment and taking it one moment at a time so that we can sort of solve it gradually. And the second idea is the greater mindfulness brought to the quality of our current actions. So when we focus on the present, we're able to be sort of mindfully focused on the quality of what we're doing in the present, instead of thinking about the future, instead of thinking about the past and how they relate to how we're acting now. So this technique of living in the present is emphasized by this idea of Marcus Aurelius, the depreciation by analysis, and it's an interesting Stoic technique. It means decomposing something in its constituent parts so that it becomes easier to deal with. So part of the thing here is that things lose their ability to charm our minds when we look at them objectively and examine what we are made of. So our fear about something, our unease about something, is often due to the fact that we're not, it's more than we can take in. We're not capable of sort of looking at it closely. So if we sort of break it down and examine it and examine its parts, it loses that hold on us. It loses that fear over us that it creates. So doing this, we're able to create a kind of rational detachment from our emotional involvement with things. And a lot of Stoics practice this journaling of sort of decomposing something, of sort of breaking it down. What are its parts? What is it made of? What's inside it? In a way that enables things to become easier to appreciate. So it's interesting to sort of look at these Stoic acceptance exercises of accepting things as they are, and accepting that things are the way they are. And as we saw, that idea is a big part of the Stoic kind of view of the universe and our relation to it. So we can't change our fate. We can't sort of change the distant past or what's just happened. We can try to influence the future to an uncertain degree by changing our current thoughts and actions. So focus on accepting that the past cannot be changed anymore and the future may not be as you'd have preferred. So these are a number of thought experiments that try to sort of embody this idea of acceptance. And the first is, imagine that the universe has been designed to present you with challenges from time to time, perhaps as if they are a form of therapy prescribed by Zeus, so that you can progress towards happiness by accepting them and responding appropriately in accordance with virtue. We'll see that's part of the Hercules story very shortly. Similarly, imagine that you are unconsciously chosen and created your own fate in its entirety to help you learn and grow as an individual. So again, accepting fate by sort of seeing it as something through which we learn and through which we grow. And thirdly, contemplate the idea that events and your response to them could not have been otherwise, but were strictly determined by the laws of nature to be exactly as they were. As the Stoics put it, we don't pity infants' inability to speak because we see it as natural, and there's likewise no more point being upset about misfortune necessitated by fate than being depressed because you don't have wings like a bird. So the idea here is, because we can't change those things, there's no point in being depressed or upset about them, because they were necessitated by the laws of nature. It makes more sense for us to just accept that that's the way things are. And finally, tell yourself that nothing in life matters ultimately except your current voluntary response to events, which by definition you can choose at any time. Everything else is indifferent. So we talked about this idea of the Stoicism idea of indifference. The only thing that matters is how we act. Only thing that matters is acting well. Everything else, even though it seems to be a big deal, is not relevant to our happiness. And we can see this in the story of Hercules. Hercules sort of, at a certain point, he finds himself at a fork in the road, and he's given these two choices. He's given the choice of a life which is easiest and pleasant and a shortcut to happiness. The second goddess, Arete, sort of visits him, and she tells him that her path requires hard work and it would be long and difficult. Hercules would face many dangers, many hardships, and experience great loss and suffering. Hercules decides that he's going to go with chooses the path of Arete, and this sort of expresses this idea in Stoic thinking that they treat this as a metaphor for the good life, that it's better to face hardships, rise above them and excel, than to embrace easy living and idleness. So it's another way of thinking about what's important here and what constitutes happiness. For the Stoics, it's not simply living a sort of an easy life. It's not the absence of exertion. It's being able to act in ways that enable us to express our virtue, that enable us to act well. It's what we do in our accomplishments that sort of define our well-being and our happiness. Our actions are what define us. So we can very much see this in the story about Hercules, that it's the things that we do that matter and how we sort of rise above difficulties and express our nature in the process. That's sort of what's important for the Stoics.